Okay. Poet, performer, Mithago Craze. I really wanted to do that intro. I liked on that one. It's very cool. Um, so, how are you? It's nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. I'm doing well. I moved house last week, so everything's still a bit
Yeah,
all over the place. But
yeah.
yeah,
I hate moving house because I have to have my things like how I have them, and it just makes me go crazy.
it turns out I don't have object permanence, so as soon as everything's in the boxes, I would just panic of whether or not it still exists.
Yeah, yeah. I know that one. How did you come up with your performer name?
So Mithago is my legal first name as well.
Okay, cool.
Although I don't tend to go by Mithago in like day-to-day life.
Yeah,
I
I
mostly
can,
use my middle name.
yeah. I think
Yeah,
it's very cool if you did go by it in your day-to-day life. Yeah.
I used to, and I still do with some things. It always slightly startles me when I'm at a doctor's appointment and they call me Mithago, and
Yeah. Yeah. I'm like that with my married name. I'm like, who's that? Oh, that's me.
yeah,
Um, how did you feel when you wrote Burn a Building?
I wrote that just. I think it came out almost entirely as like one stream of consciousness a few days after um Brianna Jai's murder,
Mm,
and I had yeah, just like kind of was still in complete shock, was very angry and upset. And I think a lot of it brought me back to the time in my life when I first came out and growing up in very, very rural Devon as a queer person, as a trans person, um, and experiencing a kind of very real, very kind of justified fear of going out on my own, of walking on my own. I experienced a number of quite violent transphobic assaults while I was growing up. Um,
that's really,
and yeah,
that's
sorry.
awful. Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah. Um, which, yeah, the memories for some of that are still quite hazy. But I came out when I was 17,
Mm,
and a lot of the reason why I didn't come out earlier was a lot of fear around how that would be received, the kind of dangers that I would experience as a result of that. And it made me just unbelievably upset and angry and scared still, I think,
mm,
um, when Brianna was murdered in a kind of place and location and way, and it felt, yeah,
mm.
eerily familiar in a very uncomfortable and very kind of frightening way.
Yeah, I find that the coverage is, really horrendous. Even in cases like when Hind died, she was 6 years old and she was
Yeah.
murdered. And I think that the coverage was woman murdered. I said to a friend yesterday, I wonder if I get killed, the title is going to be extremist Palestinian protester, randomly disappeared or something. That,
Yeah,
they decide who they treat as human beings. Um,
definitely. And yeah, no,
yeah.
it's something that I was very aware of, like with the release of the video, how I would be received as a response to that. And
Mm,
but the coverage is, and it's always, it always feels strange to me that despite how frequently, as a trans person, as a disabled person, as a mad individual, how often I'm infantilized and how often other people I know who are marginalized in similar ways are infantilized. And yet, the one time where some level of acknowledgement of the fact that they were 6 or 16 or however old they were at the time would be appropriate,
Yeah.
that's the time they choose to paint children as adults in
Mm,
a way that diminishes from what has happened.
absolutely. Yeah, they try and sort of take away from it, which is insane. Why would you want to take away from it? I also know that in Brianna's case, there was some sort of self-hatred slash sexual dimension to her killing, which
Yeah.
is the case in a lot of trans violence and the case of a lot of violence against people of color. And that wasn't covered or spoken about.
Yeah, no, completely. Yeah, the ways that violence and transphobic violence and sexual violence interlink is something that I've always been acutely aware of. I think the majority of the times I've experienced violent transphobic assault, there has been some degree of sexual element to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, the trans misogyny present in so many spaces at the moment is, yeah, not addressed directly enough.
Yeah, and I think I find it very frustrating because I meet a lot of well-meaning, quote unquote well-meaning, I don't know if they're actually well-meaning, people that are like, oh, well, we need to look at both sides and stuff. And it's like, people are imminently dying. People
Yeah,
are imminently dying as we speak. And that's what upsets me. We could look at both sides if there was nobody getting hurt. Or not the both sides that, that I believe there's both sides, but yeah, we can sit and debate and, do, but people are imminently dying. And that's what really
exactly.
upsets me.
It's the same, or a lot of the same, like rage I feel at the genocide in Gaza at the moment is the
Mm,
same as the rage I feel towards what is ultimately functionally a genocide of trans and disabled people in this country currently. Lack of access to medical care is a form of slow genocide, and the NHS is segregated if you're trans.
mm. I thought to myself today, I am scared of people that I see on EDL marches, the classic guy that hates everything. But I think I'm more scared of the maybe middle class liberal woman that's, doing yoga down at whatever, but actually hates everyone. It's very isolating and it's very upsetting. Have
Yeah,
you found that you felt like, I thought I could trust people and now I realize that I am kind of on my own kind of feeling. Like, I don't know, I feel like that.
I think there are definitely waves of that, and I've definitely had a lot of upheaval in kind of interpersonal relationships over the last 6 months, particularly.
Yeah.
Um, I think for me, so much of what feels important to me is kind of not a denial of that feeling or a kind of repression of it, because I do fully recognize that that's there. But the kind of most important thing for me always has been like building community or attempting to find community
Yeah, I
or
love that actually. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah.
and like I find whenever I feel those feelings of isolation, of loneliness, of kind of that bitterness at the world and the people around me,
Yeah.
that I always find myself reaching out and trying to find people who feel the same as me.
Yeah. I wonder why, like, the news seems obsessed with trans people. Do you ever think that? Does Piers Morgan really need to do 1 hour on it every day, and also the most derogatory, horrible way that he does it? Like, you know, I don't get it.
Yeah, it's a kind of political scapegoating. It's a way
Yeah,
of focusing attention on something that does keep the media talking about it.
yeah,
Um, it's also just so much of it feels so similar to the kind of homophobia that I grew up with a lot of still hanging around, and
yeah.
that like I know a lot of older friends that I have and a lot of my mum's friends experienced.
Hmm.
And I mean, it comes from the same places, and we're already seeing the same kind of move towards, I mean, that same homophobia again, the way that the NHS has stopped supporting like the rainbow scheme and the way that LGBTQ protections generally are being rolled back across most of the West. Um,
Yeah.
it's a really, yeah, I think it's just a very easy thing to incite a lot of emotion about. And because the media keeps talking about it, that kind of greenlights everyone else to talk about it continuously, or at least
Yeah.
keeps the discussion going in ways that, yeah. I also don't think it's actually fair to call it a discussion. I don't
Yeah,
think
it's
it,
not. That's so true. Yeah, it's not discussion.
yeah, which isn't like more at myself for saying that. Like,
It's more of an assault, really, like a barrage. Yeah,
I think a discussion requires both sides to be platformed.
yeah,
I don't think if none of the major newspapers are ever publishing articles by trans women on the
yeah,
subject, then they can't call it a discussion.
yeah. Yeah, they get one. They get two people that are both hateful in equal measure having a discussion. I don't really know what that's meant to be. I do find that there's a sort of a disparity between growing up queer in London, maybe, and then growing up queer in a more sort of rural area. And sometimes I find myself, or well, a lot of the time, I find myself in the two worlds thing, which is you've got your friends in London that are like, yeah, yeah, it's fine. What's the problem? And it's like, well, the problem is that a few miles down the road, everyone hates me. So it's like you have to straddle these different worlds.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, particularly since moving to Brighton and being in a very
Yes,
queer
I grew up in Brighton.
community.
Oh my God, yes, it's the
Yeah.
best place. Yeah.
Um, and the ways that like there are benefits to growing up queer in a rural place and benefits to being queer or growing up queer in a more urban space as
Mm,
well. They're just very different, and the kind of experience of being queer in the countryside is not a thing that's discussed as much.
mm.
Because in the city, there are other queer people around. You can find them, but it's almost impossible to get away from more normative individuals who are maybe homophobic or transphobic or queerphobic in some way, shape, or form. It's harder to find spaces separate from that. And it's harder to just find spaces where you can go and be queer.
Mm.
There's a lack of space or ability to like hire out venues for queer events
Yeah.
that feel properly queer. Whereas in the countryside, there's so much space. You can go for days without having to really interact with other people. And that, from both a queer perspective and also in my own experience from a neurodivergent perspective, means you can have so much more time and space to not have to mask, to not have to hide those aspects of your identity.
Mm.
But on the flip side, it's so much harder to find other people who feel the same way.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting for like a further exploration, being queer in rural areas versus urban areas and not even looking at the rural area negatively, which hadn't thought of. I think you're proving to be more positive than me, which is which is good. How was the European Slam Championships?
It was really, really wonderful. it was a lot of work. I don't um have a lot of energy or ability to travel a huge amount due to a lot of complex health difficulties. Um, and they were really incredibly supportive with that actually. Um, and the like I had very, very few issues with accessibility the whole time. It was fantastic to be able to take part fully and to be able to go and meet so many incredible poets and organizers of poetry events and the communities around that, and to stay in touch with so many fantastic people. It's really, really inspiring and like motivates me to write a huge amount, seeing poetry in other languages from different places and seeing how that influences the writing, or the way it's performed and the context and the content. And yeah, I always write for days after leaving anything like that.
Yeah, I find that seeing people read, seeing performances helps me write poetry, which is always good.
Yeah.
And how did that opportunity come up?
That came up as a result of me. I last year, February last year, I won the UK National Slam Championships,
Yeah, awesome,
um,
amazing.
which was a huge surprise. I had to drop out of uni the month beforehand, halfway through my third year, due to health difficulties and a lack of like disability support from the university in regards to that. Sussex University. Um, uh, didn't provide any of the disability support that we had agreed to beforehand, while I'd been on temporary withdrawal. Um, so yeah, it was a massive surprise to me winning that. And from that, I was invited to represent England at the Slam Poetry World Cup in Paris
Wow, that's a big
last
deal.
May, which was really, really exciting. It was fantastic. I Yeah, I ended up coming second, which was a massive surprise to me, and very, very welcome. Filippo, who won, was utterly phenomenal. I still get bits of his poems stuck in my head sometimes. Um, and yeah, met so many fantastic people there, some of whom it was a joy to see again at the European Championships. And it was basically through that and the, yeah, contacts there. And yeah, it's been a really incredible like series of events that came completely out of nowhere and has
Yeah.
like
Did you
really
get a chance
changed.
to have a little
Yeah.
adventure in Paris to have a look around or, sightseeing stuff or not
The
really?
final was on my 24th birthday.
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
so yeah, coming second at the World Cup on my birthday was really
Just a nice
a
little
lovely
nice little
present.
touch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Do you see a difference between slam poetry, other forms of poetry, or page, or I don't know what people call them? Um, and I suppose, do you think it matters?
Um, that's a slightly tricky one to answer, and I don't massively want to shoot myself in the foot here in regards to slam.
Mm, yeah.
I don't particularly enjoy performing slam poetry these days. Um, and if I didn't keep getting invited to take part in wonderful competitions, I'm not sure I would be so much anymore. Um, and part of that is the way that slams, like the way that you have to write for slams. I don't naturally write 3 minute long poems. Um, Almost all my poetry is either a minute long at most, or more usually somewhere between about 5 and 10 minutes, which
Mm,
doesn't translate to slam amazingly well. Um,
yeah,
but I also think that there's the way that slams are scored and set up is great for some things. It's a really fantastic way for getting people into the scene and for um, providing space for performance poetry or people who are interested in poetry to be on a stage and be reading poetry and seeing what that feels like.
yeah,
Um, I do think that scoring poetry sometimes feels very strange to me. Um, and while almost every slam I've been part of has acknowledged how subjective that is, it still feels very strange to acknowledge how flawed a system is and then keep rolling with that.
yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think it's been one of the things I like about it is that it's been a great way to bring poetry to more people and not make it like oh, you got to pay £1 million to go and see this
Oh, definitely.
person live or whatever. And I don't know. I think I'm a little bit older than you, but I think when we were growing up, it was just the anthology poets and stuff or whatever. And
Yes.
now it seems like such a bigger thing.
Oh, and definitely, I find it really difficult to read or write poetry for people to read, like because of how I write and the way that I've always interacted with my own poetry. It feels designed to be heard, not read,
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
or to be read out loud by me. Like I write very much for my voice and my breath and the way that I have of saying things in almost all of my poetry is or touches on some way in autobiographical themes. And so
yeah,
I don't know, like I've been writing more of it down and like playing around with more page stuff recently.
yeah.
Um yeah, I think going back to the slam, I think that is potential. A thing that I've thought about quite a lot over the last few years is like because I do agree that there are massive benefits to slam and I wouldn't want slams to go away. I do think there's potential for maybe some evolution there. I think that the potential for multi-round slams where each round has a different time limit
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
allows for more kind of, yeah, just freedom of expression from the poets, a chance for the audience to see more different forms of poetry. I think a slam where the rounds are 1 minute long would feel very, very different from a slam where the rounds are 5 minutes long.
Would you say that you're an activist as well as a poet?
Yeah, I think activist first and foremost, really. I'm not sure if it was always that way around, but so much of the way that I write poetry and the ways that I can write and perform poetry is tied so much to my transness, to the fact that I'm a cripple, to the fact that I have neurological differences, that mean that at times I can't talk, can't write, can't read. Um, and poetry for me has always been a form of self-expression, a form of communicating things I don't have any other way to communicate, and
Mm,
a way of sharing, I think my experience, my lived experience, which has always been to me one of the most effective forms of raising awareness. And I
Mm.
recognize that I have the capacity, the ability to stand up on a stage and say things, which is not a thing that everyone's capable of doing.
Sure.
Um, and if I can stand up on a stage and say things, then I can talk about bits of my experience that aren't often spoken about. I can speak about my epilepsy, the fact that I'm autistic, that I'm ADHD, the ways that being marginalized in those ways interlinked the way that oppression oppresses in very similar ways across spectrums. Um, yeah, I think I've always been very acutely aware of the fact that I exist in a kind of, or that I am marginalized in a number of ways. I've been disabled since I was 12. Um, I've had experience with, yeah, a whole range of different forms of oppression, none of which were fun. Um,
They never are.
and no, and I think there's something about building community, about raising awareness, about being able to talk about those things that has always felt more important about than the fact that it's through poetry.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, do you think that the reason that people are I don't want to say struggling or like making this big issue out of trans rights is because of a binary way of gender being presented in more modern Western ideology, maybe post Christianity?
Um, yes, definitely. I have actually just finished a whole series of three very intense um poems exploring my own relationship with Christianity as someone who was raised uh not in a Christian family, but I went to a very, very Christian primary school and then a very, very Christian secondary school and did not have an amazing time at either. Um, and I think there's an element of that. I think that there's something inherently in opposition to the way that society is currently structured in simply existing as a trans person, specifically as a trans woman. Like, yeah, I'm trying to think of the right words to exactly express it. But there's something inherently inflammatory about embracing womanhood or femininity or rejection of maleness that the kind of Western Christian patriarchal society and gender roles that presents, the two can't really sit side by side
Hmm. Yeah.
inherently.
Yeah. So, what is your writing process?
Mm, it's a very strange one. Um, well, I'm not sure that's the best way to describe it. Um, I have very intense synesthesia, and I experience words, letters, passages of prose as color and texture and shape and movement and proprioception simultaneously. I can feel words and how they move and how they link together. Um, and I can't really explain it any more than that. Um, but my brain hands me words. Like I'll get a particular rhyme or bit of alliteration or pair of lines or something pop into my head or get stuck in there or something. Um, and I'll say them out loud or whisper them to myself or repeat them back to myself in my own head. And it kind of just flows from that.
Mm, yeah, they're
Like I
very
can,
natural. Yeah.
yeah, very kind of, yeah, intuitively, subconsciously, and almost all my poetry comes out as one continuous stream. I'll just keep repeating it from the top over and over again, and each time it gets longer. And then at
Yeah.
some point, I write that down so I don't forget it.
I love the continuous stream poems. They just feel like,
Yeah,
they just feel so satisfying, don't they? But most poets I speak to say that, and myself as well, about that turn of phrase or that scrap of thing that you get that just makes it fall into place. And I just recently I've been thinking, is that the divine? Like, is that like a divine touch? Or I mean, it could be the subconscious or whatever. But what is that that just comes in? It's because this is going to make me sound like a lunatic, but recently I felt like I've been talking to like a voice, like I hear voices, like talking to like an internal voice. And I'm like, I wonder if that internal voice is the one that's been giving the little, the little bits here and there. I don't know. Do you think it's the divine?
it's a very interesting question. Um, and I'm gonna do my best to answer honestly, but that's going to involve talking about a thing that I have not ever really spoken about publicly before,
Mm,
um, which is that I've always been very open about the fact that I'm mad, that I experience madness in a number of different ways. I've heard voices, experienced elements of psychosis, psychotic symptoms for as long as I can remember. But the thing that I've never really spoken about openly publicly, although I'm very open about it with the people around me, is that I am a system. I have DID. Um, so there are multiple parts, personalities, people who inhabit this body. Um, and for years that felt like talking to voices inside my head. Um, until I kind of could come to the realization that they're more than just voices. I have a lot of amnesia, um, from dissociation and between parts, and my writing process has always felt very linked to that. Um, so it's why I go by a different name in my personal life from performance as well. Mithago is a part of the system, the part of the system that writes and performs poetry. But most of the poetry is written in combination with other parts of the system. And
mm,
I have poems that feel sometimes slightly fragmented, that I can tell are written by multiple parts who have been writing different bits of the poem at different times. Um, we have a very non-linear experience of time. So sometimes it's quite hard to tell exactly when things were written,
mm.
or by who.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it feels less divine and more definitely something subconscious, conscious. Like, yeah, I'm never sure entirely, or I'm not always sure who hands us the first little bit that starts the poem. Um, Sometimes it's easy to tell. Uh, but yeah,
Yeah. Do you think there's like a global like awakening or something, or like something's happening spiritually? I'm like one of these people that spends a lot of time on the internet, and I think there some form of consensus is that there's like a reawakening happening, but I don't know if that's just more myth, more nonsense, more, the next thing to push on people. I don't know if you have that sense, or and if you do, if you feel like that's genuine.
I think there is, yeah, a kind of shift towards some collective understanding of different possibilities. I don't find myself often using a kind of spiritual, metaphysical language. Um, but I think that a lot of the times people in various subgroups are talking about the same thing with different languages. I think that
Yeah.
a kind of collective awakening is very is kind of the same thing or very interlinked with the realization of a whole bunch of parts of the ways that the world work not functioning simultaneously.
Mm.
The
Yeah,
fact
that
that
makes
climate change is rapidly requiring a huge shift in the way that we think about the world and how we interact with it, the ways that that is interlinked with capitalism and the inhospitability of life under a kind of late stage capitalistic system in the West, and across the world generally, how that system funds genocide across the world that then incentivizes mass movement of people, um, and that huge cultural shift, that paradigm shift globally. I think that describing that as a mass awakening isn't inaccurate.
Yeah, I find it strange when people defend capitalism because it's like, why would you defend something that hurts you so much? Like, you're
Yeah,
not a winner. You're not a winner, mate. Like, I see
no
people
one
that are
wins.
struggling, and it's like, but you're not winning. But I feel like they think if they verbally say that they like it, then they're winning by not admitting that it hurts them, which it's really sad. Which is really sad.
Yeah, it feels like a denial. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people are very, very scared of change.
Mm,
And I also think a lot of people find it's very hard to imagine a future that's you've never dreamt of, that's never been described to you, that you
mm,
have never been able to picture. You can't
yeah.
dream of a thing you can't see
Yeah.
or have never thought of. And without a clear-cut alternative to capitalism, a lot of people, I think, cling to what they know, the familiar, a rejection of change and possibility as unknown. And I think unknown, the unknown, is very scary for a lot of people. I think people
Definitely. And
like
yeah.
don't like not having explanations for things.
That's very true. And I think even science fiction landscapes still look like recognizable landscapes. I think you
Yeah.
make a really good point in that we really don't know what the unknown will look like. Even Star Trek or Dune or whatever, it's still recognizable, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
There are always features that are familiar,
yeah.
but there are things that you can draw from to draw an idea of what the future could look like. I mean, it's a huge part of community building for me is presenting alternatives. It's why I exist so publicly in the ways that I do, is a form of possibility modeling. If someone can see me and even have the smallest spark of realization that existing in a way more similar to that is possible, and that is a positive change for them, then that's a positive change. Like, I don't really care what sparks that or what incentivizes it or how that is. Like, growth is growth.
Yeah. Do you think there's a lot of people older than us who are trans, never were able to express themselves, and are
Yeah.
very unhappy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So many.
Yeah.
Yeah. Until you have the language for something, until you can dream of the possibility, it's very hard to
Yeah.
express it or to
Because I
believe it.
always think I always meet women in straight relationships that are gay, and it is sad. Who are some of your favorite poets and why?
Oh, that is an incredibly difficult question to answer. Um, in a kind of, well, maybe not that. I think growing up, I read a lot of poetry and I grew up in a family that heavily incentivized reading, and being interested in that sort of thing. So I grew up around a lot of Shakespeare, around a lot of kind of romantic poetry. Um, but I think a lot of my inspiration initially for writing came more from music than poetry.
Mm,
Um, I've always listened to a slightly insane amount of music. Um, like there's almost always music playing in my space or in my headphones. And I've always been really, really heavily influenced by lyrics and have listened to like a really wide, still do listen to like a ridiculously broad range of music. And it's very hard for me to actually name poets that were inspirational to me when I started writing. Um, I think naming favorite poets these days is hard for the other reason in that there's far too many incredible poets that I'm
yeah, that's true.
incredibly lucky to know. Um, I have always and will always have a huge place in my heart for Catherine O'Driscoll, who has always been so incredibly lovely to me. And I met them at Uni Slam while I was at uni and was just blown away by them. And yeah, honored to know them. Um, I absolutely, oh, there's far too many. I saw Joelle Taylor read from Canto last year,
Yeah, she's amazing.
and that was definitely a transformative experience. Um, I think if I had to name, I don't know if I can name a favorite poet because that feels unfair. Um, I think the piece of poetry that has stuck with me the most and was the most meaningful to me was I saw, getting slightly emotional actually just thinking about it. I saw Jasmine Gardosi's. Dancing to Music You Hate last year. Um, and
Great title. I don't know, but that's a great title.
it's a blend of poetry and beatbox and Celtic dubstep, and it was a absolutely transcendental experience, exploration of queerness and identity and yeah, neurodivergence expression. It was unbelievable. And yeah, the most powerful piece of like performance poetry, spoken word art generally that I think I've ever seen,
Hmm.
experienced.
Yeah, actually thinking about it, it is. I would find it easier to say pieces of poetry than favorite poets, although my memory is so terrible that I would just be like, I don't know. Um, when was like the first time you sat down to write a poem? Can you remember, or your entry point into it?
Um, oh, this is going to sound like such a horrible cliche answer, but I have been writing poetry my whole life. I, yeah, probably started writing like as soon as I could write, um, all through primary school and like secondary school. I think the first time I really started like sharing it publicly was during while I was at sixth form. I had a oh, I had a poetry Tumblr that is no longer existent.
I had
Um,
a poetry Tumblr. It's like, it's like,
yeah, it was a thing for a while, but like that built confidence, I think, to share it more. Um, it's always been for me a way of processing the world, a way of expressing things that I experience the world primarily through color and texture and movement. And I always have to do what feels like a two-step process of translating my experience of the world into words and then in translating that into words that make sense to other people.
hmm,
And
like,
poetry has always just been a way of skipping the whole second step completely. I
hmm,
don't have to make the words make sense to other people. It's their job to work out what it means.
hmm. I love that feeling when the words fit. It's just gorgeous, isn't it? It's like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you write anything else, like short stories or anything like that? Or I'd like to write scripts, but I can't seem to write anything other than poetry.
Um, I have done in the past. I've written odd bits of theatre. Um, I'm slowly in a very, very disabled, neurodivergent way, putting together a show that might never fully coalesce, but hopefully will someday. Um, but I don't tend to write much else. I write poetry, I journal, um, which often turns into poetry. Um,
Hmm. This is going to sound weird, but do people ever tell you you're funny? Not in the sense of your work, but only like in your day-to-day life? Because I have this theory that a lot of poets would be good stand-up comedians. And I actually started doing stand-up because people are like, oh, you're
I've
pretty
thought
funny,
about
kind of
it.
funny.
I
Yeah.
have written odd comedy skits with my little brother and
Yeah.
things. We
Yeah.
um were in like drama groups together. Um, yeah, the two go hand in hand. I think for me, a lot of it feels like I've never met a performance poet who I wasn't convinced had ADHD, and almost all of them feel very potentially autistic to me as well as someone with autism and ADHD who has been around other ADHD people my whole life. Um, and similarly, I very rarely meet or see a stand-up comedian who doesn't feel incredibly neurodivergent. And I
Mm.
think there's something about the difference in the way that neurodivergent people experience the world that allows presenting things as entertaining.
Did you say poetry's improved your life?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where I would be or what I would be doing without poetry, but
Mm.
I'm fairly confident that I'd be enjoying it less.
Yeah, same. I don't know where I'd be if I'd be around. It seems like society is increasingly fractured, doesn't it? What do you think is the way forward? It's like we're all in pockets, and there is no cohesion. I wonder if there's ever been cohesion. I think we're posthumous, whatever that word is, presented a picture of cohesion, and I don't know if it's ever been there.
Yeah, I think for me, so much of it boils back down to community and not community in the way that I often hear that word used to refer to like, this is my community, they're my group of friends, and we don't talk to anyone else.
Mm.
But community is in a way of being able to treat everyone else as human, being able to respect everyone else's autonomy, and yeah, I think just shifting towards being able to interact with people even if you don't like them. I think so much for the way that my activism and my disability justice practice, if you could call it that, interacts with the world is very much centering the fact that care cannot be conditional on how much you like someone.
Mm.
It doesn't work. And if you have to ask for care, it's not care.
Yeah.
And building communities, spaces, networks where those two principles, along with the autonomy of everyone, like
Mm.
that has to be at the core, that has to be at the center for me.
Yeah. Are you influenced by nature in your work?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think,
I thought you might be because your Instagram is really like walking in the woods and mushrooms and things like that.
I mean, I have a huge back, head, neck piece tattoo that will be a tree that covers from the bottom of my feet to the top of my head. Um, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, on the edge of Dartmoor, and nature has always been an escape for me. I can't live without green spaces. I can't live without the sea, without like wide open expanses, and without forests. I just get so sick every time I'm away from trees. I don't know what it is. Like my nervous system needs that regulation. I need to just be able
Mm.
to go sit in a field or under a tree or on the beach at least every couple of days.
Brighton's nice because you got the
Yeah.
sea there. I think most of my seminal moments in life I was looking out at that sea. So it's
Yeah.
very beautiful. Yeah, I have this idea that if you grew up by the sea, you always return to it.
I very much can't be away from it for too long. I couldn't
Mm.
imagine not
Yeah.
living by the sea.
What was it like supporting? Is it the Dolan on tour? How do you say it?
Yes. Oh my God. That was um one of the most intense experiences of my life. Um, both the joy of being in those spaces, being around those people, be as one of the most wonderful, incredible, radically authentic, like supportive intersectional people I know. Phenomenal. Um, it was also a very difficult period of time. I found out that one of my closest friends passed away halfway through the tour. Um, and B was absolutely wonderful, best tour dad I could have ever possibly hoped for. And also um, has very intimate lived experience of disability, of being unable to move for long periods of time, chronic pain, and having touring with someone who understands that I can't sit in a van all day, that we both need to get out of the van and immediately smoke a very large joint and then lie down on the floor for 3 hours until we have to be on stage, was just so incredibly wholesome. And the kind of intergenerationality of that as well um,
Mm.
felt really, really just wholesome, connected. Like, I think B is one of the most fantastic examples of like how to function in a community that I've ever seen. The way that he pulls people together is just always so positive, so supportive, takes absolutely no shit,
Mm.
and will
Mm.
not like take up space that isn't his to take up, like endlessly as platforming queer artists, black artists, Palestine funds. Like, I've never not seen him actively talking about something like that in a way that made me feel hopeful, if that makes sense, that there are people
Mm.
like that in the world.
Yeah. What would you say to poets that don't have much exposure or don't really know, how to get into it? What's the best way to go forward and find opportunities?
I don't have a good, compact, short answer to that. Um,
Mm.
and I don't think I would be being authentic if I said I could give a good answer to that. I don't think that poetry should be limited to only people who have that platform, who have that exposure.
Yeah.
And I've never actively sought it out.
Mm.
I write poetry and I read that poetry when people let me.
Yeah.
And it's never been about the money or the praise or fame or bragging rights or anything. I
Mm.
write poetry because I have to, is the way I process things. And I read the poetry because I have to, because the poetry needs to be read.
Mm.
And I care about writing the poetry. I care about performing the poetry. I care what my friends think and the people who I care about and the communities I'm in. I care what they think. I care about doing it in a way that's ethical, that allows me to take time for myself to rest,
Mm.
that cares for the people around me. Um, and I think that's the most important thing, like centering the authenticity and the care.
Mm.
I think the best advice I have to like particularly people who are just getting into performance poetry or slam poetry particularly is like make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Like,
Mm.
what do you need before? What do you need after the performance? Like, if you're writing about or in relation to your own trauma or the trauma of communities that you're part of, like, make sure that there's space to hold that pain, that loss, that grief. Like, I'm a huge believer in putting in place like genuine aftercare plans for yourself after a performance.
Mm,
And I think that, yeah, make sure you're keeping yourself safe when you're performing, like more than anything else.
mm. I find I really burn myself out, and then I'm just like, why do I do this to myself? So yeah, yeah, I think that's very true. You want to say yes to everything, don't you? And then, well, I do,
You
and
really
then by
do.
the end of it, you're like, I have absolutely nothing left. Um, and finally, what does Palestine solidarity mean to you?
I think for me, it means that like I can't support a system that is complicit in genocide. I won't do that, and I won't support solidarity with Palestine is solidarity with people experiencing genocide everywhere in the world. It's solidarity with Ghana, it's solidarity with Congo, it's solidarity with queer people across the West, it's solidarity with trans people in the UK, it's solidarity with indigenous peoples across the world, with black people, with Jewish people, with like there is nothing there is nothing for any of us without all of us. And
Hmm.
we are the only people who are going to do anything about that.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's yeah.
yeah, whether what you can do is raising funds or wearing a keffiyeh in public or raising awareness or talking to your friends or actually boycotting organizations, events, Eurovision, standing on a picket line, setting up an encampment at your new university, like
Hmm.
holding space for other people to talk about that.
Yeah. I find that people aren't going to come along and meet our demands. People aren't going to come along and give us the world that we want. We're going to have to go out and create that, and that's what so I'm not going to sit in my house and someone's going to knock on my door and say, oh, by the way, we've stopped killing Palestinians.
No.
It you know all liberation movements have been fought for in this way, and I think that's what people miss a lot of the time.
And I think more than everything else, it's centering Palestinian voices and Palestinian needs. Like solidarity for Palestine means doing what the Palestinian people are asking for more than anything else. In the same
Mm,
way as solidarity with any group, like platform them.
mm. I find there's an awful amount of pinkwashing that goes on as well when they try and say, oh well, Israel is safe for queer people, and um
Care
Gaza
is
and the
not
West Bank isn't. It.
Care and solidarity are not transactional. It shouldn't
Mm,
matter,
absolutely.
regardless of what, like, I don't support Palestine because Palestine and the Palestinian people will support me. I support Palestine because they're people, and no
Absolutely,
one
yeah.
deserves to experience genocide.
And we don't know how many of them are gay. We don't know how
Exactly.
many of them are trans. Yeah, because then they're not allowed to express themselves because they keep getting killed. Yeah.
Yeah, I will not support Israel and never have done. I'm Jewish, have been all my life. It doesn't matter. Like, I don't believe in killing people.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to me. I hope you enjoyed Brighton. Don't be a stranger. If I'm ever there, I might message you and say, "Oh, do you want to go for a
Yeah,
coffee or
please
something?"
do.
Yeah, it's been lovely chatting to you. I hope you have a lovely
And
rest of your day.
and
Take
you
care.
too.